Well, hello, my friends, and happy Sunday, and welcome to this week's episode of My Journey with Jesus. My name is Dave Little, and I am so pleased and so blessed that you all have tuned in to this week's episode as we continue to journey imperfectly with Jesus and learn from the study of His Word. Today, our discussion will continue in the book of 1 Peter and chapter 1. Peter began the chapter, as we have looked at over the past couple weeks, by introducing the theme of hope. And it has certainly been a joy to examine Peter's discussion of hope and the hope that the resurrection of Jesus brings to our lives. And in this next section of chapter 1, Peter will begin a series of practical instructions on how we are to live out our earthly lives in the context of this hope. So let's take a look at verse 13. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ, as obedient children, not conforming ourselves to the former lusts as in your ignorance. This actually encompasses verses 13 and a little beyond. But as Peter begins his instructions, he starts by reflecting back on the truths that he presented in the opening section of this letter. Like one of my old Bible teachers back in Ohio was fond of saying, "What's the therefore? So let's talk about that. What's the therefore? By way of review, Peter has spent the first 12 verses of his letter recounting a variety of blessings that God has given us through the resurrection of Jesus. Our inheritance, eternal, secure, and undefiled. Our hope that stems from the knowledge that we have that eternal inheritance awaiting. And based upon our hope, last week we talked about how our hope instills in us a sense of overwhelming joy and the opportunity to experience overcoming strength in our lives whenever we face trials and temptations, and in particular in the time that Peter wrote this, he was writing it to Christian churches around Asia Minor that were experiencing directly persecution, and promising us that God gives us the strength to overcome that through our hope in our eternal security. So with these blessings in mind, Peter tells us that it is time to gird up our loins. What does that even mean? This week I spent some time learning all that I could about girding of the loins. What is this girding of the loins of which Peter speaks? I went to a website called The Art of Manliness to learn about girding up the loins. And this is what I learned about the girding of the loins. In the olden days, in ancient times, when men commonly wore a tunic, the girding of the loins was a way to prepare for action. When you had on this long tunic, a man couldn't run, couldn't jump, couldn't fight unless they pulled up the lower portion of the tunic upwards and secured it at their waist, like we see the fella in the picture doing here. And in so doing, in girding up the loins, this freed the man for whatever vigorous course of action was necessary while still wearing his tunic. So to gird up the loins simply meant to prepare for action. And as much fun as it is to talk about girding up of the loins, today we will take a deeper look at that and figure out what Peter is really talking about here in verse 13 and how we can apply his advice in practical and meaningful ways. So for context and for clarity, we'll take a look at this verse again in the New International Version. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace that is to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. So this translation comes from the New International Version, and for me and for probably most modern readers who have never girded up the loins, this gives us the clearest view of Peter's instructions, that we are to prepare our minds for action. Be alert, be sober, and set our hope on the grace of Jesus. In the first section of chapter 1, Peter's reflections focus on resting in God's hope in the face of trials and being able to patiently endure the things that the society was inflicting upon the Christians of the day. But as we look ahead in this letter, the call to resting in the assurance and the hope that God gives us will be juxtaposed with an encouragement to a more rigorous preparation for the trials that we will endure and for the service that we are to perform in our grateful response to his salvation. This preparation begins with the mind. We are to cultivate a mind that is alert and that is fully sober. In practical terms, Peter wants us to develop minds that are disciplined, sober, and optimistic, hopeful in our journey with Jesus. When we center our minds on Christ and on his return, and when we live accordingly, we are able to escape the many worldly things that would encumber our minds and hinder our spiritual growth. It all begins with the minds. And in the commentary called Be Hopeful, Dr. Warren Wiersbe calls on the illustration of Abraham and Lot to demonstrate this point. Abraham had his eyes on God and not on the pleasures of earth. By contrast, when Lot set the location to establish his city, when he looked at the lands and Abraham offered Lot the opportunity to choose whatever land he wanted to settle, Lot's focus was on the most desirable earthly situation, and he let that guide his thinking. And over time, Lot moved closer and closer to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were full of immorality, and he and his family became ensnared in that immorality, while Abraham was able to keep his integrity. Abraham disciplined his mind to focus on the gifts of God and the mission of God for his life, and Lot found himself distracted by the pleasures of earth. So it was Abraham's discipline that enabled him to avoid that temptation and maintain his integrity and service. The sober mind is a mind that is clear and rational, a mind that is not altered by the influence of any other controlling force, whether that be alcohol or any other stimulation that would cause us to lose focus on God and cause our minds to cease from thinking clearly. The world is full of influences that can take control of our minds, not just drugs and alcohol, but pornography, materialism, greed, our leisure time pursuits, even good stuff like political engagement or intellectual achievement. If these things become the focus of our minds and the focus of our desires, then we will lose our clarity of vision on God's purposes for us. The sober mind will not indulge in any of these influences in a way that would surrender control of our faculties. When we're so driven by something or so controlled by something that we lose our ability to think clearly. Instead, when we focus on God's plan for our lives, our minds will be alert and aware of the temptations that may overtake us, and also be alert and aware of the opportunities around us to love and serve people in the way that God designed us for. Finally, Peter calls on us to maintain an optimistic mind, a mind with our hope set on God's grace, which is to be brought to us by Jesus Christ. The return of Jesus and our joy and anticipation of spending eternity with Him gives us a positive outlook on the situations we find ourselves here on earth, gives us a sense of optimism. This is not a hopeless condition that we live in, but we live in step with God's eternal security and His eternal salvation for us. And that gives us a sense of optimism in the face of trials and in the face of all of the worldly temptations that we face. Yeah, I know in my life, when I screw up, I get really angry with myself. I get caught up in guilt. And in the worst times, sometimes it just feels hopeless that I am so bound up in my weaknesses and my flaws and my character issues. Certainly we need to be alert to the things that would tempt us, and we need to strive to remain free of the influences of things that would pollute our thinking. But in the end, our eternal future with God is the source of our hope and is the guiding light to see us through the things that would entangle us and frustrate us. And the end result of that process, as we will explore in more detail next week, is that when we walk in God's hope and when we keep our minds alert and focused on Him, our lives will be set apart for Him in a condition of holiness. Holiness is the outcome here. Hope gives rise to holiness. We'll read more about that next week as Peter writes in verses 14 and 15 that we already read a little bit of. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as He who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. And that is the mindset that God has in store for us and that He wants us to prepare ourselves for by girding up our loins and being alert and being fully sober. And that is where we will pick things up next week. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in this week. It is great to be back with you once again. Had the opportunity to spend time in Iowa this weekend at the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame induction banquet, and enjoyed that very much. Got to see some legends of the wacky world of professional wrestling, and also got to reconnect with some friends, including one fellow who listens to this broadcast and reflected on his listening. So it is always great to run across listeners in various places. Just a real blessing to know that folks are out there listening and tuning in as we all journey with Jesus imperfectly and as we all seek to walk in His Word and to learn more about His character and to muddle through this messy life together. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, as always, please give it a like. And in so doing, you can promote this video in the YouTube search algorithms of other users. If you want to hear more from the channel, you can hit the subscribe key down below, and you'll get notified whenever new content is posted. And that is where we will wrap things up for today. Once again, the good Lord willing, we'll be back on the channel next week and continue in our discussion of the book of 1 Peter. And until then, thank you all for listening. God bless you all, and go in peace.